We're excited to welcome to the show the recruitment and staff development coordinator for the LA Dodgers, Chase Aldridge. Chase, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we first learned about you as you're a host on the Staying Connected podcast. And I think you guys have started recently. What can you tell us about why you started it, and what can you tell us about the podcast?
Yeah, so connected with a couple of my friends, Ian Walsh, Alec Hammond, Ben Baggett, and it's kind of had the idea of starting this podcast up with relation to baseball and performance, right? So they have an online platform where they do training for athletes, professional, college, etc. And they kind of wanted to share some of the ideas that they use in practice on this podcast. So we use it as a space to talk to professionals across the industry and also in technology to kind of see where the cutting edge is, I guess you could say, of baseball development training.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've enjoyed. I've listened to about 3 or 4 of them now, and really enjoyed it and learned from it for sure. And that's kind of what we were drawn to. You guys were talking about the ecological approach and seemed to have a good understanding. Like, oh, really cool. Like someone in the Dodgers organization is taking this stuff on. So I guess that's just where we wanted to start, just kind of understanding how you got into skill development from an ecological perspective, and yeah, what drew you to the framework.
Yeah, so I guess back in 2019, when I first started with the Dodgers, my manager at the time told me that motor learning was something that's like worth diving into and getting interested in. So I started off looking on the internet, finding different case studies, etc. But during the pandemic year, we actually had a small book club where we read nonlinear pedagogy, and that's when I kind of like really took off. So it was me and 5 to 6 coworkers, and we read it. We went through like a chapter a week, and I think for me, I kind of accepted it quickly because I came in with the idea that America is not the best at developing athletes, right? I'm a huge soccer fan, follow like Barcelona very closely in their academy, and so I already believe that there's a better way. And so when I saw this information, I was like, duh, like this just makes this makes too much sense. And then I was also fortunate we have people in our organization that had already done research into this kind of stuff. But yeah, that's how I got into it, which is not the most convincing story. I know other people have like some ups and downs to get there, but I read it and was just like, yes, this is it.
Yeah, and I know if people don't know, you went to Harvard, so quite intelligent guy. I feel like people come across nonlinear pedagogy, they go running the other direction. So it sounds like it clicked right away. But you had no like in at Harvard, you didn't take any sort of like skill acquisition or anatomy, or you had no background in it, just right to it.
No, yeah, there's one class I took. It was called Game Theory with Applications of Social Behavior, which is not related to skill development or anatomy or anything, but it talked about using like a different framework to understand human interaction and how we connect with each other. And so I think, again, there are kind of influences in the past that predisposed my mind to being open to these kinds of ideas or thinking that there were alternate explanations for things, but nothing related directly to sport at all. Yeah.
And you say you accepted it really quickly. How has it been accepted by the Dodgers, I guess, from both the players and the coaches?
Yeah, so I was actually very fortunate. We've had a couple staff members that have been in this stuff before. Like we had Rob Gray visit us before I was even with the Dodgers in 2017. He audited practice, and it's so we've been kind of always looking for new ways. And obviously, there's certainly some variance on the individual level from coach to coach in terms of how bought in they are. But like I said, we've been kind of pushing the envelope on skill acquisition for a while and has people that are super into it. Like our pitching department has some really, really, really smart people that just came into the organization already open to it. So I think staff-wise, people have been open. And then from a player's perspective, it depends, right? Some people have different training histories. So if you get a kid from college, he might be a little slower to adopt some of these ideas. But I think fortunately we have a reputation by now where we earn some trust on the front end. And then also when we work with younger players, like 16, 17-year-olds, they might not know another way. So if you just start training with them in this way, then that's just what it is. So I think, like I said, I've been fortunate that I was situated in an environment that where these ideas could even be possible, right? Where I didn't get pushback immediately for trying some weird stuff out.
I don't know how involved you are, but if you have a sense of on the hiring end of coaches, because I imagine there'd be some people you hire, like they just like fight against it right away. So are you hiring? Do you guys like, you need to know they have a background in ecological dynamics, or is it more just, oh, they're a learner? Or how do you go about like making sure they're the right fit for the organization?
Yeah, I think it is more the latter than the former. Just like bet on the person, bet on the personal traits, and then train the skills. So I think even shoot, like myself, if I didn't know anything about this when I first got hired, and so I think if you have the curiosity, the intellectual humility, creativity, etc., like you'll figure it out. And honestly, I think this is something we have to say is that a lot of these drills and training styles have been done for a while, right? There wasn't a framework necessarily behind it, but acknowledging that a lot of coaches are using really, really creative strategies. They just don't know like the word affordance, but that doesn't mean that their practice wouldn't align with it. So sometimes just giving a theory to help explain what they're doing is really powerful and not that difficult.
Yeah, and probably helpful and gives you more trust and more like belief in what you're doing, and gives you more tools on how to execute it at a higher level. So what do you guys do on the player end? So say you have someone come in who's, I don't know, a top prospect and is trained in a traditional way, a repetitive way, and they've had a lot of success. Do you, have to completely change them, or is it you meet them halfway, or how do you interact with that, especially when they're like, no, this has worked for me?
Yeah, I think that's always a challenge. I think that's just coaching to some extent, right? Like the relationship building part, the connection part. I don't think there's not a cookie cutter answer to this. I think it kind of depends on the person, and
Right.
especially if we're talking about like co-creating these environments. And that's something that I've thought about a lot recently, especially in this role. Is it's kind of like it would be against the ecological approach or against an implicit learning style to impose a type of training practice on players or coaches. And so how we go about that is a really good question that I'm still trying to find the answer to, honestly. I don't think there's an absolute answer, but yeah, I think that working with the player and kind of starting with where they're coming from and then trying to build from there is a really powerful strategy.
It's awesome to have an open mind. I'm sure it's a lot more accepted when they feel listened to, feel like they have a say in what they're doing and a part of the process. So then how about on the education side? What have you guys found is helpful as you bring in, maybe we start with coaches first, like you bring in new staff. What's the first steps? And I guess what do you find kind of clicks with people and connects and gets them to start to buy into it?
Yeah, so I think the first step is just acknowledging that we all do have a theory. Like there's a reason that we implement the practice that we implement. Usually it's from our own history and experience as players or as athletes, but I don't think that any coach goes to practice and like tries to not help players. Like everyone's trying to help out their players, and there's a reason for it, even if it's super linear and super based on traditional fundamentals or super explicit. Everyone thinks they have. Everyone works within some type of framework. We just don't reflect on our own framework very often. So starting from acknowledging that, and then it goes to like, okay, if this is where we're starting from, and we expect our players to grow, then we should expect ourselves to grow too and be open to new ideas. And so from there, you start what I call like destabilizing their thoughts by asking questions. Again, I don't like to. I'm still not sure what the complete answers are, but I don't like to like impose on coaches or staff or players. So I might ask like, what is consistency to you? And then if we show two different videos, then like, and they're both home runs, is this player consistent or not consistent? Like what is skill? And then we can watch someone imitating a professional player, or we can watch someone actually doing the actual skills. Like, is there a difference between these two things, even if the movement is technically the same? And then once you kind of break those things down, it's okay. If we believe that you can't repeat movement, if we believe that skill has to be embedded in some type of context, then what does that imply for our coaching? And I think from there, that's when you can really start to jump, like use that as a jumping point to dive into these ideas a little bit deeper.
Yeah, but as a coach, they feel pretty destabilized and and lost for a little bit, but it's cool to feel like they have someone like you guiding them as they go. I heard you on your guys' podcast, you talked about writing your name on the board. Could you give that example?
Yeah. So one example that I like to use is bring someone up to like a whiteboard and have them write their name twice. And no one can do it the same way. And you ask someone in the crowd, like, hey, like, what are the differences you notice? And maybe the E is a little more crooked or bigger, or maybe the C is at an angle. I don't know, but it kind of highlights the point that if we can't write our name twice, which is I think a relatively simple task in a sporting context, then it's probably pretty difficult to, I don't know, like do the same serve 2 times in a row, or throw the same pitch 2 times in a row. And again, trying to bring up these ideas helps, I think, highlight why this is important, why this is an important topic to dive into. And second thing I'll say about that is that we often are more able to see how this is like a truth or potentially a truth outside of our own context. Because when we're in our own sport, it's so easy to be like, I did it this way, this is how it is. But when we take you outside of that, whether it's a different sport or different activity, I think minds become a little bit more open.
Yeah. How do you know it's not, you just haven't had enough prescriptive writing drills? You haven't had the right coaches giving you the repetition. I don't know, Chase. I'm not sure if I love that example. I think it's really powerful. So if we move to the player side, so the player, and I don't know, I'd be curious to see what you think. Maybe they don't have to understand like what an affordance is. They don't understand the constraints-led approach or differential learning, but they do have to buy into like wanting to do it and like being motivated, and motivation is really important. And if this is a little funky and a little different than what I'm used to, like, so how do you go about educating them to make sure that they're on board?
Yeah, I think it goes back to like the co-creating idea. So if there's an opportunity for us to give the player options on what drill to do or what type of practice session we're going to do, I think that helps with buy-in. So maybe I have 3 different options for something that is related to the thing I want to train today, and I let the player choose. And obviously, that's not something that always happens, and there's time constraints that takes way more time in planning ahead. But I think that's one way, and then another way is just by tracking progress in practice is a good way for players to see the benefits of it. I think we're very fortunate in baseball where everything is statistically tracked. Like it's so much easier to see, oh wow, I'm hitting the ball harder now, or I'm throwing the ball harder now, or whatever it may be in baseball than in some other sports that are maybe a little bit more qualitative. Like where I was evaluating a soccer center back, it's probably a little more difficult than evaluating a pitcher's velocity, right? But because of that, I think it's easier to see the progress in baseball, and that helps the buy-in.
What is some of the pushback you have received? And when it comes, like, how do you respond?
Yeah, I think the main ones are kind of like the traditional one of like, I've had a lot of success doing my coaching this way. I've seen a lot of players get better, which is 100% true. And then the other one is, okay, this is something that we can do sometimes. Like this is a type of drill rather than a way of thinking. And that's kind of the thing I always push back on, right? It's less about, hey, this drill is really weird, or this environment that we're creating is very weird. We can do this like on Monday and Tuesday, but Thursday and Friday we have to do something like more traditional. I try to take a step back and just talk about it as more like, this is a way of thinking. Like we can do more traditional drills as well, but they're just for a different purpose. So that's how I try to respond to it, rather than kind of critiquing the actual type of practice. Like if someone wants to use a tee because it makes them feel good before a game, okay, that's fine. But that's the purpose of the tee in that moment, right? It's not to necessarily for skill development, unless there's a very, very, very specific context. So thinking about why we do the things we do and kind of reflecting on that, I think has usually been my strategy when there's pushback.
What about, and not even just with data, like, so you guys have all this data in the moment, but even just performance, with this approach, like if you're destabilizing someone's movement or constraining away, like their performance is going down in the moment, right? So what do you do with players with that? Or like, no, look, I'm not throwing as fast. Like, how do you keep them motivated when like I'm failing even more than I typically do?
Yeah, I think that's our job on the front end. Some of our coaches talk about this really well, but like setting the expectations, right? So if you're throwing a different type of ball, like it's not going to go 95 miles per hour. It might be 55, and that's like a really good throw. Or if you're swinging, we're hitting in a very difficult environment, like maybe moving 7 out of 10 balls forward is like really, really good. And kind of setting that standard before typically helps. Obviously, there is like a portion that is confidence in that, like the player has to want to keep going and keep doing it. But hopefully by setting those expectations on the front end, then it makes it possible. And then also, like, this is like a really simple hack, I think, but making things competitive works all the time. So instead of it being always individual and, hey, I'm struggling, it's like, okay, well, the guy next to me struggling too, and we're going back and forth and trying to figure out, see who can figure out the solution to this problem first, or who can, stay in the cage the longest, or who can throw it the hardest or throw it the furthest. I think that's a great way to keep players from focusing so much on the failing, because it's like me versus you rather than me versus this machine or whatever it may be.
Yeah, that's cool. I'd love to hear, I don't know if you're able to share maybe some specific constraints that you guys have used. And I when I talk to volleyball coaches, I kind of hate this question. It's like, you're just looking for a recipe. Like, you just want to drill from me. Like, I want you to understand the principles. But I feel like when I'm talking across sports, it's helpful, like, to, oh, this is something we tried. And then then I can, oh, how can I bring that sort of concept in? So I don't know if you have any that you could come to mind. It's sometimes fun to hear.
Yeah, I think, I think one that comes to mind that's pretty simple is just realizing that the like implement that you have in your hands as a hitter affects your movement. So we've used different size bats to encourage our players to explore like different solutions, basically. Yeah, it's like if I throw the same pitch to you 2 times, but you have a different bat in your hands, you're just going to move differently. And I think we can, like I said, because one of the fortunate things about baseball is that we can see the data and we can see the biomechanics of it and how it changes. But that's, I think, is like a really, really simple example of making a small tweak to the task, but having like large effects on movement and kind of, again, destabilizing maybe a previous movement pattern.
Yeah, that's cool. There was one, you guys had that BYU guy on, he was talking about difference. They were trying, it was like specific to trying to get like a sweet spot on when he was catching. I thought that was pretty cool. Like some mini gloves, some big gloves. It's just like feels like low hanging fruit. Like it's not that hard to do. Like give someone a new bat and like there's this implicit learning going on. So yeah, I think that stuff's really, that's cool to hear, and it's fun. It just seems like such a fun way to learn.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm curious more, going back to like when you're doing the education side, as you worked with especially coaches, you can, and I found you can go through a session and explain, what representativeness, what perception action is, explain the constraints-led approach. And they're like, yeah, this is great. Yeah, I think I do that. And then you go out and see their session and they're doing what they've always done. Like they're hitting off a tee. They're making things really blocked or repetitive. Is there things you found that like help people take the academic side to the application side?
Yeah, I think one thing that's worked pretty well is when you get people across domains working together. So if we have a pitching coach, and a hitting coach and an infield coach working together, and then we throw a problem on the board and like solve this problem, people being outside of their own lanes, I think opens them up to thinking about different kinds of solutions. And then hopefully that leads to them changing their own practice. So that's probably the first one. I think really taking people out of their own environment is a really important one. And then the second one is really, really, really encouraging people to reflect, like write down their practice ahead of time, like plan it out, and then reflect upon it. So I actually learned this from Barcelona. I saw some of their like practice scheduling, and they would every day like write what kind of practice they did. And then at the end of the week, it wasn't like this is bad because we didn't practice X type of thing enough, but it was more like observing how much they practice X type of situation. And then, okay, maybe next week we're gonna practice this more. But I think in the same way with skill acquisition, it's like, if I write down exactly what kind of practice I'm doing and then I reflect upon it, like, oh, wow, I kind of haven't done things that align with what I believe, then that helps us adjust. Obviously that takes the open-mindedness and like the acceptance that this is the way to do things in the first place. But if we say that we believe it, actually seeing what you do in practice, I think, is really, really useful, because we don't get to observe ourselves. I think that's a big hole in like in sport, right? Like we always judge the players in front of us, but it's very rare that we judge ourselves and evaluate ourselves.
So baseball is obviously a big business, and there's a lot of tradition, so change can be hard to make. I don't know. It feels like maybe it's just the guests we have on this podcast that relate to baseball, but it seems like more teams and organizations are getting behind this more modern approach to skill acquisition. Why do you think that is? Is that even true?
Yeah, I think in baseball, some people say like adapt or die. That's a thing you'll hear often. And like I said earlier, baseball is really, really, really easy to observe statistically, right? Like I can see who's doing better and who's doing worse. And so if one team all of a sudden starts doing way better, then it's like, oh, well, like maybe maybe we should look into what we're doing. I think it's a lot easier to see those differences, and because of that, it's becoming accepted. And then there's also been people like Rob Gray, who's has a podcast and kind of works in the baseball space, or Franz Bosch, there's a lot of people that are, I would call, like more famous, that have helped kind of push these ideas forwards. I think going back to my very first answer, there's just not as much research on baseball specifically in this space, but the fact that there are some larger figures that are really pushing things, or have maybe some of the most popular podcasts or some of the most popular talks, I think has really helped push things forwards.
Yeah, I wish Rob Gray had gotten into volleyball. Had to do baseball.
Yeah.
So you've brought up a couple times different sports and your draw to Barcelona. It seems like as a coach, it's the easiest thing to go like observe. If I'm going to go outside of my team to go watch another baseball team, or for me another volleyball team. Is going outside of sport, have you found that to be beneficial? Is that something that's commonly done within the organization? How do you guys approach that?
Yeah, I think for me that's super, super common. Like you said earlier, like it's easier to get ideas sometimes, or maybe you think of new creative solutions by getting outside of your sport and seeing kind of what's possible. I know in baseball, there's been a lot of inspiration from javelin, for example, for throwers. And so that's been a huge influence on pitching development. So I think for us as an organization, that's certainly a thing that we look into, whether it's bringing in people from other sports or other disciplines. I think there's always ways that you can connect what different sports are doing to what your own sport is, or at least be open to maybe there's like a little thing that I can implement. So that's something that we definitely look into, or at least, and myself specifically, like I'm the person that will just DM a random person on Twitter and be like, I would love to talk to you and see if I can learn from them.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear you bring up soccer a couple times, because I couldn't think of like two more different sports. Like baseball is like, stop, one-on-one duel, kind of organized, and then soccer is just chaos, constant movement. But there's principles and things you can learn by. It's approaching things ecologically, right? It's like looking and taking in the world around you and learning from new environments. So it makes a lot of sense. And I think it kind of plays into, we wanted to jump into the next topic of this idea of wayfinding, which I first learned from Carl Woods. We were lucky to have him on the podcast a couple of years ago. And you said it's been really influential on you. Can you remind us, it's been a little while since we got into this topic, and our listeners, what it means to wayfind?
Yeah, I hope to not butcher Carl's words, but
tough act to follow. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, it's kind of the idea of being attuned to your environment. And I think if I remember correctly, it was looking at like how hunter gatherers navigate the world, and navigate their way through the world. And so rather than, instead of looking at like a predetermined path or trying to, I think the analogy he uses all the time is like, we use GPSs to decide where to go. And rather than that, being attuned to your environment and kind of appreciating your surroundings and exploring it to get a better understanding of them, rather than just looking to get to the point you're going. And that gives us a better understanding of the world around us and our surroundings, rather than, just kind of focus on the destination.
And how do you apply that idea of wayfinding when it comes to working with coaches on their journey?
Yeah, so there's like this one page from one of Carl Woods' papers that like has really stuck with me. And he said that basically the conclusion of the paper wasn't really a conclusion because that implies that there was a defined beginning. Um, and that the papers kind of emerged through different conversations, through trips to the coffee shop, through his own writing, right? And so I think similarly that when we work with coaches and staff members, like it's not, hey, I need to put this information in your brain and now you're good to go, right? Like we're on this continual journey of finding and searching, because like I'm the first to admit I don't have all the answers. Like I'm not. If I did, like every player would be great. If we had all the answers and knew exactly what to do all the time, all of our players would be great. And so when working with coaches or working with players, um, I think of it as like this continual journey and really trying to, I like the way he said, like co-respond or interact, kind of like really when you break those words apart, it's like there's a dualness to it, and kind of really being where your feet are.
Yeah, it's helpful. And what about on the athlete side when working with athletes?
Yeah. Similarly, it's letting players explore, right? Like trying to, I think I'll say it, like in 2020, I tried to impose like a style of hitting on our players, and it went really poorly. And from that moment on, I kind of, again, like I had read NLP already. I'd read nonlinear pedagogy. I talked about it, but I was one of those people that read it and believed it, but still went out and like, I know this is how people should hit. Um, and so for me, interacting with players, it kind of, that moment was really humbling. Is like, okay, like I don't have the answer, and how can I create an environment that lets players explore, especially using the knowledge that I have specifically about the sport. I can be more intentional about the environments that I create to help them, to guide them towards certain areas or certain parts of the solution space, right? And so that's kind of the way I've implemented with players, and especially in like a game setting, it's redirecting their attention maybe from traditional stats to some other measure of performance that I think better aligns with their own development.
Could you go through an example of, let's say I do maybe have a sense as a coach of what I think could be best for this player, but I don't want to just vomit it on them or say you have to do this. So what would that interaction look like? Like what would that process go, if I was trying to, explore and help them wayfind to find maybe something that I thought was potentially good for them?
Yeah. I'll use a simple example. Okay, if there's an infielder, for example, who we don't think he's low enough when he's fielding ground balls, one way would be to tell him, hey, get lower. Another way would be give him a smaller glove. Another way would be use a smaller ball. Another way would be um, maybe give him like a time constraint that makes him have to be more efficient. And so I think using those are three different ways. I'm sure there's a million more, but looking for ways to let the player find their own solution. I think the trap of baseball and of world like sports where there's a lot of biomechanics is that we think we understand exactly what is going on in the sport. And so to me though, that information has shown me that, okay, yeah, we have an understanding of how to create speed or kind of what the best players do, but the best players have a lot of variability and they swing in different ways and they move in different ways. And I think understanding that should help inform us, okay, if maybe the best players, and I'm not sure about this, but maybe the best infielders to field a ground ball, some of them extend their elbow and some of them bend their knees more and some of them lean more of their torso. It's like, okay, these are all different options for how to field a ground ball. You're not using any of them. I'm going to try to encourage you to try at least one of them. Which one will be the one for you? I'm not sure, but we're going to try to let you, explore those different solutions to solve the problem.
And what if on that journey, maybe we use a Franz Bosch term, like it seems like they find a stable, like a tractor, or they find something that does seem that it would be helpful. Is it, I don't know, kind of want to avoid explicit instruction, but how do you maybe capitalize on that? Or do you, or just let them continue to go on their journey and they implicitly hopefully hold on to it?
Yeah. I still think there's space for being clear on like what the goals are before practice. So if the goal is to be a better fielder, then if I can measure and say like you're better now, then I'll show the player that they're better now. And what they do with that information is still obviously up to them. But I think players traditionally tend towards wanting to be like repeatable and consistent. Like those are words that we hear all the time.
Yeah.
And so I don't think we have to push as hard to remind them to be repeatable and consistent. If that makes sense. It's like that's what they're attracted to. Like that's their mentality attractor. So I mean, I guess I've been fortunate, so I haven't run into as many situations of players losing a good solution. But even if that does happen, I think that's where it's our job to create a practice environment where those worst solutions, I don't want to call them bad solutions, but those worst solutions are less likely to appear, right? So if I give you too easy an environment, like, and you can go back to your old habit, then that's on me. It's not on the player.
Mm. And I don't know if this is in your realm either. As I've gone through some of this with assistant coaches I've worked with, and then introduced the idea of attractors, like, oh, that seems more traditional. Like we're trying to go towards something specific. I guess how do you fit like within this wayfinding perspective? Like how does this idea of attractors fit into that worldview?
Yeah, I mean, to talk about like some of the fringe boss says, like certain things are just natural to the body, right? So if you throw an implement overhand, like you're going to reach about 90 degrees of shoulder abduction, and there's nothing you can do about it. So I think there's certain things you just have to accept as laws of the world, just how gravity acts upon all of us. There's certain things that are just going to be there. Like I'm about 6 feet tall. I can't become 6'6" overnight. And so that's going to constrain what I can do. But it's still working within it's like really understanding the individual and the organism, and then going from there. I don't think that necessarily crashes with wayfinding. And for me, again, the idea is more, okay, how can I help you explore yourself, explore the solution space? And obviously there's going to be times when you're moving more, it's quote unquote consistently. But that doesn't mean I still can't give you a ton of different environments that are representative and to help you prepare for the game no matter what. So it doesn't have to be explicitly just in a movement sense. It can also be in a perception sense.
That's great. So as I was hearing that, I can imagine someone listening like, yeah, this wayfinding concept sounds great. I love it. But Chase is working with professional athletes. Like I'm coaching a 12-year-old. Don't I need to tell them I have to give them at least some fundamentals, or I got to start them some basics? I can't just let them wayfind their way. How would you respond if someone is saying that?
Yeah, I mean, I think talking about fundamentals is a huge thing. Like for me, I think fundamentals we've traditionally thought of as repeating some type of movement in an acceptable way, and I like to think of it more of repeating tasks that should be being consistent with tasks that should be completed at a high rate. So if fundamental is a bounce pass in basketball, to me, it's not the way you pass the ball. It's okay, if I pass it 5 feet, like I should complete 100% of my passes, or 99% of my passes. So as long as I'm completing 99% of them, I don't really care how I do it, right? It's just as long as it's functional. And so I think honestly, even more so with young players, and this is something that, again, as a soccer nerd, this is something that people in that world talk about a lot, right? It's like we're taking away the creativity from players and preventing them from exploring certain ways that later on we admire Patrick Mahomes for throwing sidearm passes, or we admire Leo Messi for dribbling in a really, really creative way, or Barry Sanders for the way that he can like move on the football field. But then we tell our young kids that like, no, you can't do that. So that those two things kind of don't make sense. If the goal is to have players play for as long as possible and enjoy the sport they play, I think we should really allow space for that creativity.
Yeah, I love it. But I have a 10-year-old. What I've observed, it's the opposite. It's, here's the fundamentals and here's exactly how to do it. And I have all the answers. And if you don't do it right, I'm gonna make sure you know. So if you're working with talking about soccer, like a beginning soccer player, what would a wayfinding practice look like? Or what would be some introductory, like how would you begin with a true beginner?
Yeah, I'll use the classic example of dribbling, and people talk about like, should we use cones or not use cones? I'm pretty firmly against cones, but maybe it's
They're boundaries.
yeah, exactly, they're boundaries. And so maybe it'd be like me passing the ball to them and giving them more space before I come and defend them so they can think and act and move. Or maybe it's even them playing just like flag football without a ball. Or maybe, I don't know, I think there's a bunch of different ways that we can introduce stuff. But going back to like in Spain, the rondo is a very popular drill, and there's some controversy over whether it's good or bad, right? Especially from the idea of like there's no direction to it, there's no opponents, etc. I think that the biggest thing with soccer drill or soccer environments is that we allow the athletes to explore. So if that means that they pass with the outside of their foot, but they complete the pass, that's okay. But a lot of times we see like, okay, 2 touches, like pass, touch. I think there's a coach, Juanma Lilo. He's like Pep Guardiola's assistant, and he had a really brilliant quote where he's like, "I feel bad that I like ruined soccer because everyone wants to play the 2 touches now." And it's like, you don't. The point wasn't to play 2 touches. It's like sometimes you play 2, sometimes you play 1, sometimes you play 10. Like, but it depends on the situation, the context. But soccer is a sport where, yeah, it's even still kind of dominated by some traditional thinking.
Yeah, it's yeah, and it's cool to see what Europe's doing, and I mean, there's lots of examples of just how naturally it's, I don't know, the favelas in Brazil and how this stuff, like kids have learned all these like movement principles and foundational skills without someone, bossing them the whole way through it. But I think it's always an interesting conversation because I run into that a lot. Like, yeah, I buy into this stuff, but what about beginners? Like, no, especially beginners.
Especially beginners. Yeah, I love that.
How about oh, sorry, Bill, you had the
just curious how you use wayfinding in your own life, because I know things can be very structured and scheduled for us in advance. So how do you implement it on your own learning and development?
Yeah, I think kind of talked about it a little bit so far, but it's like looking at different sports, looking for different influences. I think there's a Walt Whitman poem that I always go to. He said, I think it's Song of Myself. He says like, "I'm large, I contain multitudes." And I like to think of that idea of like, we contain multitudes as people and we are multifaceted. And so, yeah, for me, it's not just reading, like I am reading Dexterity and Development right now, but by Bernstein, but it's also reading like The Design of Everyday Things has been a huge influence on me this year. It's by, I don't even remember the author, but it just talks about like, there's this really lovely example of the author explaining that if a door is supposed to be pushed and the users pull it, that is bad design. And how all the things that we use on an everyday basis, like, are typically understood as to what their purpose is without us needing like instructions or a sign, and how we should be intentional about designing environments that allow those things to happen rather than it being like needing a 10-page manual to do it. So I think that's one example of things that I've looked into. I'm really into like teaching, like formal teaching. I listen to like this podcast called what's it called? I forget what it's called, but it's by teachers, and it just talks about pedagogy in the classroom and conversations about they have. And so, yeah, I'm a very curious person. I like going to different rabbit holes and different topics, but that's kind of the way I think of it for myself. It's just always being willing to read random things or read weird stuff or listen to new ideas.
Do you still use your GPS?
I do, but not to work. I know how to get to work now.
Hey, there you go. No, when I first learned about it with my wife, and we'll still do it sometimes, like, all right, let's wayfind. Like, let's put that phone away. Yeah. But it is pretty convenient, especially with LA traffic. Like,
yeah, it's tough.
But I love even just the spirit of it. Like, if we could bring more of that spirit to our modern world, I think we'll experience and appreciate the little things more often.
Yeah, for sure.
So wanted to move into the last topic that you had suggested, definitely a topic we have not covered. So it'd be fun to get your insights, this idea of socio-cultural effects and how they influence practice. So it'd be great just to start out just what you mean by socio-cultural effects.
Yeah, so a lot of this comes from research from Mark O'Sullivan and James Vaughn that I've been into. They were able to do research at a Swedish club called AIK. And that's the paper that kind of really got me into thinking about that. So I think we talk about the constraints-led approach and having an organism and having a task and an environment, but social-cultural constraints and effects certainly make up part of that environment. And if we think of movement at a system level, then the societal pressures and the cultural context certainly have an effect on how people move, right? So that's kind of what I mean by social cultural effects. It's how societies are organized, maybe how a culture values a sport, or maybe how even elders are respected or not respected in certain cultures. All those things can affect how people interact and how people act on the field.
And how have you seen those effects play out with the Dodgers or other sports organizations you've experienced?
Yeah, so the example I always use is I think it was, yeah, last year, 2022, I was in the Dominican Republic for their Independence Day, and they had a home run derby. And not only was there a home run derby, there's a senior citizen category home run derby. So that just showed to me like how in that culture, one, baseball is hugely important, but two, the home run is seen as like this really, really big cultural thing, right? Thinking back to even like Sammy Sosa or some of Latin Americans' biggest sluggers. That is a part of their game that is way more focused on versus like me. I grew up in Los Angeles. We play small ball, we bunt a lot, we hit and run, play defense, probably because like we want to win at the high school level. And there's other reasons too. Like I think there's some benefits to it, but using those two examples, I think really, really showed me how the effect of a culture can drive how people see the sport, right? Like there's just different things that are seen as valuable within the sport, even though we're playing the same game.
Yeah, we have a friend who's a high level coach who's coaching in Korea and just went over there 3 months ago, and he coached USA, like Olympic stuff, and there's more of like this servant leadership kind of idea and being in it together. And then he goes over there and like he walks in the room and they all kind of like genuflect, and like there's this completely different dynamic and obviously this completely different society that created these things. It's just really fascinating to consider because I don't think we often do. So then if I'm a coach and I want to learn more and understand more about these backgrounds and these cultures, what's the first step? What can I do?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question, but that's I think asking questions and really trying to understand where your players are coming from is a big thing. There's one idea that I really, really loved that Marcus Sullivan talks about, which is the idea of amplifying and dampening affordances. So rather than trying to impose or take out certain opportunities for a player, it is more, okay, if we think certain things are best practices or lead to the most success, can we amplify them in our practice and amplify them for our players? And then for things that don't align with best practices or we don't think will lead to their success, can we dampen their attraction to those affordances? And then learning about them is really being as open to our players and getting to know them as possible and asking questions about their culture. Obviously, it helps if you can literally live there. Like I was very fortunate to spend 2 years in the Dominican Republic, or your friend was fortunate to actually live in Korea and kind of experience it at the ground level. But at the very least, all of us can ask questions and really participate in like co-creating with our players to understand what they value and what they want to do in their practice.
So you're saying just because maybe I'm from a different generation or socio-cultural background, I can still connect with players?
Yeah, 100%. And just honestly, coach has been doing this forever. Like I think this is one of the examples of like, sure, there wasn't research. Like I read this paper for the first time 2 years ago, right? But there's been coaches. I was coaching before that with our Dominican players, and people have been coaching with people from different cultures since the beginning of time, right? So I don't think that's a limitation. But we certainly should spend time to try to understand where they're coming from. And I think that's something that's been a very popular coaching tenet for a long time, is really, really getting to know your players, really getting to understand them and their backgrounds.
And do you have any like questions that you've found have been pretty effective in getting to know them and getting them to open up about their backgrounds?
Yeah, I mean, my strategy is usually like food and music. I think everyone has food and music. So I'm often in control of the music that's getting played in practice. So maybe one day I'll just like, hey, like you're on the aux today. Like, what do you got? And that gives you a little insight into them. And then if there's an artist that maybe there's a song that you really like that you never heard before, you can talk about that. Or maybe if there is a song that you have heard and you really like, you can talk about that as well. Or maybe you just hate it and it's something to make fun of. Like, there's a lot of different options, but I think most people at least enjoy music, and most people enjoy food. And so you can always use those two as ways to try to connect with people.
What's your go-to music?
Ooh, yeah, the Spotify Wrapped and Apple Music stuff just came out yesterday. So I don't know. I'm traditionally more of like a hip hop R&B person, but the last few years, Bad Bunny was my #1 artist this year. It shows that I lived in the Dominican Republic for 2 years. So I'm pretty open. You know, I listen to salsa now. I listen to bachata. I listen to dembow, and then I also listen to like some house music or some other different kinds of music. The one that's still, I'm not gonna lie, the one that's still a struggle for me is country music, but it's a big part of baseball, and I've learned to find the songs that I don't hate. So
yeah.
John, do your girls let you control the speakers of practice?
They will, just as a joke, like put on one of my favorites,
Mm.
and that's 1 out of 100. But yeah, I was just thinking too. Billy's a big Bob Dylan
I don't
fan.
even try.
That's not country though.
It's just it's poetry, John.
Poetry. That's how people get fired up when they go to the plate. Put on some Dylan. Okay, so one more on this concept. So you talked about the player coach dynamic. What about within the team? You have this, especially baseball, these huge teams with all, someone from Texas, from the Dominican, maybe from Asia. Like, how do you make sure you're honoring and considering and get people to consider, the socio-cultural effects?
Yeah, I completely honest. I don't think I'm the expert in this subject right here. But speaking to some of our managers and just having conversations with some of our people with a lot of experience, it feels like setting expectations on the front end as to like respecting each other. I know these are like traditional coaching things, but in the culture code by Dan Coyle, they talk about like being a part of a group, and this group is special. We have high standards, and I believe you can reach these standards. I think that still is like a valuable way to go about it, because people really enjoy pulling for each other, right? Like when you're on a team, people enjoy others having success, people enjoy having fun, and I think that's one way. And the other way, it's not something that I've tried, but something that I really, really want to try, is the concept of an anti-talent show. So put ideas in a fishbowl, everyone picks one out. A month later, we all perform. Maybe it's you have to play guitar, maybe it's you have to sing, maybe it's you have to dance, but kind of putting ourselves out there as people that are vulnerable and people that are all learning, I think shows the humanity in all of us. And I think it's a good exercise that we could probably all endeavor upon to one, have some fun, and then two, like I said, kind of put us all on the same level.
Yeah. So actually, with my team in 2020, the COVID year when we just resumed, we did that, and it's probably one of the coolest things I've done in my coaching career. And the girls they're now like seniors who did it, they'll still bring it up as one of their favorite memories. And I think to see me too as a coach, like we made sure we filmed the whole process. Like once a week, you'd like show kind of your progress, and to see, us in the learning process. I think it brought a lot of connection and helped me probably empathize more. So yeah, I'd definitely recommend. I know Trevor Reagan talked about that as a concept, and it's a cool one.
Yeah.
Well, just to wrap up, you mentioned a lot already. You can tell you're such a learner. Podcasts or books that you would recommend for coaches? I know you already mentioned a couple, but any others that you'd recommend other than, of course, your podcast?
I mentioned nonlinear pedagogy. I think that Rob Gray's books are a good way to get into it, specifically How We Learn to Move is kind of a softer landing than reading like nonlinear pedagogy or reading Dexterity and Development. So that's what I'd recommend. And then, the design of everyday things. I think it's not directly applying to sport, but I think, in that book, they talk about affordances. And I think Actually, probably my favorite explanation of affordances is in that book. Just the way he talks about using household items, right? Like using a chair. What can we use a chair for? To stand on, to sit on, to walk underneath. So I really enjoyed that book as
By
a way.
Don Norman, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that one.
Yeah, as a way to talk about it. Actually, the cover is like, it's called like the masochist teapot. So the handle and the spout are on the same side. So you use the teapot and you're gonna burn yourself. So just the how design is really important to how we go about our life every day. I really like that book this year.
Awesome. Well, this was fun. I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us. It's so cool to hear what you guys are doing in your organization, and it's exciting for us. I think sometimes you feel like we're in our little bubble trying to spread this, and like, wow, like a huge organization like the Dodgers is doing it too. And I think it helps give us all of us more hope and maybe more behind building this momentum of bringing ecological ideas, wayfinding. I think it's just going to make sport in general better for everyone if we continue to build this momentum, and I think you're making a positive step towards it. So appreciate you spending the time and doing this with us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you guys for having me. And yeah, I hope that these ideas continue to spread, just because ultimately, like, this is about kids having fun. I think it's a more fun strategy to practice with.
100%.
Thanks, Chase.
Crushed it. You're like a pro.